Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the workshop. And today I'm going to I'm going to talk on the work that we have spent almost 4 years on within the MoveUp project. And it's about qualitative approach to material appearance problem. So if someone asks me which is the paper of mine like I'm most proud of, it will be a very difficult question, but probably I will answer that this paper, which has recently published to the Journal of International Color Association. And it's been a long journey from preparing the physical objects to conducting experiments and analyzing 20 hours of video. And the most complicated and difficult task was to really convince the reviewers that in the method we have used. So this is just one of the quotation of one of the reviewers. This is not a scientific paper. I cannot assess its validity because we didn't have statistical significance reported statistical power sample size, because we used a bit different approach that is not very common to our community. And it was like qualitative inductive research method from social science. And the prejudices and skepticism towards qualitative research is not unheard, unfortunately, in all communities. And there is even a paper that describes that from the statistical point of view. But let's now jump into material appearance. So we're pretty skilled at assessing appearance. For computer, these are just like pixels and numbers, but you, I think, don't even need a second to tell what materials those cups are made of. Which one do you expect to be solid, rigid, or maybe fragile, a bit soft? Which one is glossy, transparent, translucent, or matte? So we get a lot of information visually, and the mechanism of this is still not very well understood. There are different ways to measure the optical properties of materials, but the problem is that how they relate to visual perception by humans is still unknown. There is a lot of unknowns between optical, physically measurable properties and human perception. And that's why there is a whole direction in vision science about perceiving material appearance and material appearance attributes. There are different approaches. Usually the most common approach in the community is so-called hypothetico-deductive studies, where the researchers hypothesize something and then conduct the experiments and then draw the conclusions, either falsify the hypothesis or find some support for that. And this can be either for example, finding the link between optical properties and perceptual properties. For example, how roughness of the object affects gloss, or this can be an image domain that is more like a recent trend. Okay, how image statistics, for example, skewness of the histogram could relate to glossiness of the depicted object. But in any case, there are some quantitative studies. For example, one example can be psychophysical experiments where visual stimuli are shown to human observers. This can come in forms of different forms like computer graphics, RGB photographs, physical objects, and then they're given some visual task, for example, peer comparison, which of the two images shows the glossier object. And then based on their responses, there is some statistics and trying to correlate physical or image properties to human response. And then there is a whole statistical fitting to find the correlation. But unfortunately, human perception is not that straightforward, and it has a lot more facets and a lot more unknowns. There are a lot of challenges in this kind of approach. So the first one, the one I faced when I started my PhD was what to study. Okay, we assume we have some hypotheses, but when the field is so understudied and there are so many unknowns, where should we start from? Which hypotheses are interesting? Which ones are worth investing our limited resources in? So this was the question I was asking myself, what should I do? There are so many unknowns, for example, in gloss perception, how we perceive gloss or how we perceive translucency. And that leads to another challenge that we might face, that the experiments that are organized for studying perception is very unnatural from what we experience on a daily basis. So there is like lighting conditions are fixed. Usually it's conducted in the lab in the dim conditions, controlled distance to the object. Most of the time there is no interaction possible. There is no haptic information. You cannot touch the object. You cannot move that. And for example, sometimes chin rests are used that are stressful for the observer. So this is not what we are trained on. So when we assess appearance of the objects in our daily lives, we don't do that in the same conditions as the experiment is conducted on. And as Anderson noted very well, like the experimenter might unwittingly remove some fundamental information that is very important for the human visual system. Some maybe limit some behavioral pattern. And then this kind of experiment might provide little insight how our visual system actually functions and how we actually assess and appraise appearance. Then there is the third challenge. So we have some visual stimuli with particular optical properties or particular image statistics, and we have some statistics calculated on human responses, but most of the time we treat human visual system as a black box. So we have input, we have the responses, but there is very little to investigate why they responded this way, why they made this decision, why, for example, this object is considered glossier than this one, or the other way around. And there are, of course, sophisticated ways to try to have deeper insight into that, like neuroscience, to see like what parts of the brain get activated, eye tracking, which part of the image is more like salient. Also the data itself, if you like can say like something, what is the difference between like a stimuli and what observers are looking at. But sometimes it can be like even like a lot simpler approach. Yeah, sometimes you can simply ask the observers, so why do you think this is more translucent than this one? Or why do you think this is glossier than this one? So sometimes the response is more straightforward and we can get a lot of information from them. Challenge for the prejudices. So most of the time in this kind of research, literature review is done before starting the study. So we do the literature review, we know what is the state of the art, and then plan the experiment and conduct on the analysis. But then this might lead to some predisposition when you want to really discover new things, that you are influenced by the state of the art. And there is a risk of cherry picking, that you really try to force your data to be consistent with the state of the art. There is temptation usually with that. And that's also highlighted one of the advantages of the research method that I'm going to talk about, because it avoids this problem. So then again to the question, where do I start from when I was starting my PhD? And then one of my supervisors, Jean-Baptiste, came with a great idea to use the methodology from social science and just like organize a social experiment where we observe human behavior, how humans behave in unrestricted, uncontrolled conditions when they're asked to assess appearance. And then another thing, we ask them to explain and justify their actions. So why? Answer like, why do you do this? And why do you think so? So we used the physical objects that were handcrafted by the artist. We had 17 observers and gave them like 11 different tasks, very simple visual tasks. For example, cluster the objects by their appearance, or order them by translucency or glossiness, or rank them, and so on. And then we recorded the whole process with like 2 viewpoints, 2 cameras, and analyzed the results. And the conditions were not controlled. It was either like, it was dependent on meteorological conditions, whether it was sunny or rainy outside. And we allowed them to interact with the object freely, move them, touch the objects, even like if they wanted to describe the object, Google the definition or on the internet. So we gave them the freedom. And Then the first step was relatively straightforward. We published quantitative data, so the results of the ranking or clustering of this kind of like the tasks. And that was interesting in itself. But then the main trick was, how do we process more than 20 hours of video? So that was the main main contribution of this work, that we wanted to get something more than just these numbers. And how do we mine some data or like get something meaningful from these videos? And then the answer was in grounded theory analysis. So grounded theory analysis is derived from grounded theory approach, which is a popular methodology in social science. It's qualitative and inductive research method. And in the world, dominated by hypothetico-deductive model, as I already said, we usually take the hypothesis and test it. But then the question is what those hypotheses are. And one of the authors of of this methodology, the original methodology from Chicago School, I think, said that we overemphasize rigorous testing of hypotheses and de-emphasize the discovering of what concepts and hypotheses are relevant for the substantive area being researched. So, and then the idea is like at an inductive research method, get observations to really form the hypothesis. So to discover the ideas, to look for the ideas and discover interesting trends and directions to really increase the understanding of very complex phenomena. So this is like a puzzle, as they describe. You start getting things sorted out, label some similar phenomena together, and then you try to find the links between them. So they differentiate the two types of research as justification path and discovery path. So justification is when you have the hypothesis and when you are looking for either a falsification or support for that. And the discovery path is really to look for the ideas that maybe no one has thought before, or maybe that is something interesting and that is worth following up. And this needs openness and very little a priori bias. So you need golden mean. Of course, if you have absolutely no idea about the field, you can do this, but also you should try to really postpone literature review in time and try to be open to anything, whatever emerges from the data. But this is not against hypothetical deductive models. This complements that. It generates the hypothesis and the ideas that will be followed up by quantitative studies. And then there are 6 stages where you code interesting observations or all observations, then categorize them, similar ones together, find the links between them, then find additional support to really integrate and come up with a model. And then this leads to a theory. Those are the references. And the main advantage of this approach that it's a never-ending loop. So you generate the observations, you compare that with the state of the art, and that's how I organized my PhD. And then you test the relevant hypothesis, you update the state of the art, and that also helps to improve your understanding of the original observation. Oh, yeah, that's why we observed that in that experiment, then you recall. And then you go again, and this enables you to really reinforce your model over and over again. Then we came up with a qualitative model that describes our data, how human observers solve the tasks. And for example, like on the left-hand side, object is affected by conditions of observation, then the observers selected particular methodology that implied comparison with some standard or reference. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this model because it's not the focus of today's talk. So you can read the paper if you're interested in, or approach me on the coffee break. But what I'm going to talk about is particular interesting behavioral observations that helped us really then generate meaningful hypotheses and really was the inspiration for a successful quantitative study. And it's mostly about conditions of observation in material appearance and also different methodologies or approaches to solve the task by humans. I want to show you this video now. bluish tint here, it's a little more here. And again, if I look at the shadows, I see very, very small bluish tint here, it's a little more here, and it's very bright here. Which one makes me think that this looks more translucent, but this can be due to the shape as well, because this is very well shaped, I know. And the collect all the things to create this bluish tint, and here it's more scattered around, maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's geometry, but yeah, now I'm actually look close to geometry. Oh, it's more process. This one. Oh, it's difficult. Yeah, generally this torch itself is pretty opaque, but due to presence of these thin areas, so this honestly these thin areas doesn't look the same as this one because it's too much different in terms of color and translucency. So yeah, so we have 20 hours of video like this, and from this 90 seconds, what we observed. First, caustics is used to assess translucency, and I was like myself, I didn't have read many papers that time, and I was naive enough not to know the word caustics, and I tried to explain it with my words. Oh yeah, here is bluish tint in the shadow. So caustics used for assessing translucency, shape affecting the appearance, translucency appearance. Illumination direction is important because when I want to assess translucency of the object, I pick them up and looking for the brightest light source, so that was sun that time, and looking toward the sun. So I put them in the backlit condition. And conceptual ambiguity. So the object that has like varying thickness, thick and like thin parts, then it's difficult because some parts look very translucent, some parts look opaque, and then I'm confused. So is it translucent or opaque? So which one should I say? And yeah, this kind of observations then, when grouped and categorized together, help us form the hypothesis. And some of those hypotheses turned out very well aligned with the state of the art. And even today, because these experiments were conducted almost 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago. And even today, when I read the papers, I sometimes find something that recalls, that directly link what I've seen in the experiment. So for example, just like very vivid illustration, the paper that demonstrates that backlit objects look more translucent than front-lit ones. And then this might explain why humans who are not aware of like appearance studies pick up objects and try to put them in backlit conditions to really assess whether it's translucent or opaque. Some observations are pretty new and have not been reported in the literature before. For example, this object looks pretty opaque. There is no cue or indication that this is translucent. But if we have a look at the full context, then the caustic pattern, the bluish tint in the shadow that is like due to transmitting light, tells us that this is a translucent object. And then this inspired our work to quantify this experimentally. And our experiments have shown that when caustics are removed from the image, but all the rest is kept intact, material starts looking less translucent. Conceptual ambiguity, this also inspired us to write the paper where we discussed a lot of conceptual ambiguities our observers faced when dealing with translucency. So, what are perceptual dimensions of translucency? How does it relate with opacity and transparency? Where does transparency end and translucency start? And how do we quantify translucency? What is more translucent? It is more opaque-ish or more transparent, or somewhere like near the hypothetical golden mean in between? And do we have some degree of translucency constancy, like color constancy? And how should we separate translucency of objects and materials? For example, of these like vast objects, should we measure the translucency in the thin parts or thick parts, or how translucent is this object? Can we have one number? So this kind of conceptual ambiguities make it challenging to really tackle the problem of translucency perception and communicate it in a proper way. Let's have a look at another video. This one is short. So here I'm trying to compare glossiness between two objects. And if you look, I'm tilting them. And okay. So this is consistent with the literature that motion affects gloss perception and increases gloss constancy. So it helps us actually estimate reflectance properties, and also really separate what comes from the specular reflections and what comes from the surface texture. And yeah, this is also consistent with a very important notation by Ged, where the author says, like, an observer must look at the surface of an object from two or more different angles to receive enough information to attribute a value to gloss of that surface. So when we have just still image, it's an ill-posed problem. We can never say whether, like, we can never be 100% sure whether particular highlight is a paint on the surface or specular reflection. So the motion helps us understand this, because the texture moves with the object while specular highlights remain relatively static towards the observers. And this is another video. So here I try to assess glossiness of the 5 spheres.
These specular reflections look the same, so except for these damaged areas. Classify them out whether I see myself, or whether it has a neutral effect. So you are choosing this effect, that's how you can use them as draw. Yeah, because I tried to use the specular reflection, but they all look the same.
Okay, I tried to use a specular reflection, but they all look the same. So I now check whether I can use the sphere as a mirror. So this shows us that gloss is multidimensional. So we have specular gloss, we have distinctness of image or contrast, or like different dimensions, and this is consistent with the state of the art. And also the dichotomy in observer responses, which is enabled by multidimensionality of gloss. So some observers prioritize one cue and others prioritize the other cue. And and this is the case for these 5 spheres. Initially, in the original paper, if you have a look, we have like very broad overlap between the confidence intervals, and we say that, okay, 5 spheres, they have same surface, they have same glossiness. But then when we really start watching the videos and transcribing the videos, we understood that there are actually 3 different groups of the people. People who considered like all of them equally glossy because of the same surface finish, people who considered like darker opaque objects glossier because they said, oh, I see higher contrast, I see myself reflected, as I did in the previous video. I can use this as a mirror because I see a reflection of myself in the object, so this should be glossier. While the others, that we call the luminance group, considered like objects A and B, the translucent, more shiny ones, because they were transmitting more light and they were more like shiny, and some of the caustics were mistaken for specularities and so on. And then we followed this up further and conducted another experiment, this time with complex shapes, as you see on the right-hand side, the bust shapes. And this shape is interesting because it has very complex surface geometry, and it does not enable seeing the like a mirror environment reflection. And in this case, we also had like in the here reddish color corresponds to more opaque objects, and greenish color in the plot corresponds to translucent object, and blue is the one in cluster 2. And then we see that For most of the observers, the majority of them considered in the ranking task, considered translucent ones glossier, even though surface reflectance was nearly identical, because they mistook these peculiarities, internal like caustics, back reflections, for because of they shine more. The cluster one objects, I'm talking about them. They shine more. They consider them glossier. While cluster 3 objects, although they have similar surface reflection, specular reflection, they considered less glossy because they do this time, unlike spheres, they do not enable seeing like really distinctness of image, like surface reflectance. So you can't use this as a mirror. That's a difference from the sphere. And then we followed this up also in computer graphics, where we found that subsurface scattering affects perceived gloss. So most of the literature, if you have a look, is about like surface reflectance. But if you have same surface reflectance, but very subsurface scattering properties, that affects gloss. For like simple spherical objects, smooth sphere, which you can use as a mirror and can have very clear distinctness of image gloss. Albedo is negatively correlated with gloss because more light it absorbs, higher is the contrast, and better you see the reflection of the environment. While when you have very complex shape, higher amount of scattering and lower amount of absorption leads to higher coverage of the specular of the highlights, saturated pixels. And then the observers do not know whether this comes from subsurface scattering or comes from specular highlights. So in this case, it's opposite. Higher scattering and lower absorption is associated with more glossiness. So in both cases, like the ones on the right were considered glossier than the ones on the left for both the shapes. And the number below that is the subsurface scattering albedo. So to summarize, the approach we used is in no means and in no way opposite of like traditional deductive studies. So it's more like complementary that helps us discover ideas, discover interesting directions that are worth testing further with quantitative proper like deductive or quantitative methods. And we humans are trained or like appearance assessment from birth, and we're very good at that. We, as I show you, like I'm sure you deduced and inferred the properties of the materials very well. And then researchers can get inspiration from our natural behavior, like how we do that, how we do assess translucency when we are not restricted in our daily tasks. And that might provide very interesting insight in how our visual system functions and what information it uses. And finally, interdisciplinary research might help us to advance further. It's not the job of only vision scientists or computer scientists or neuroscientists or social scientists or like artists, cultural heritage people, but all the groups together can benefit each other and can make sure that that progress is done faster. In this case, we are not social scientists, but we use the methodology developed by social scientists to generate very interesting insights into material appearance. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, we have exactly 2 minutes. Thank you.